Greetings! This is the Mad Hermit with you once again for another video blog installment. As you can tell, a few things have changed on the Mad Hermit. Namely, for one, the webcam angle has changed. Now, the reason for this is that after so many years of neglect, disarray, and disorder, I have finally cleaned my room. Thank God. So now, with this update out of the way, I hopefully that you can get used to all this, as I'm still getting used to all this this new angle and this new setup. But before I go overburden my update, I'm going to go on to read this new poetry installment. And today's poetry installment that we're going to read is for Robert Frost once again. And the poem is The Impulse. The Impulse. It was too lonely for her there, and too wild. And since there were but two of them, and no child, and work was little in the house, she was free, and followed where he furrowed field or felled tree. She rested on a log, and tossed the fresh chips, with a song only to herself on her lips. And when she went to break a bough of black alder, she strayed so far she scarcely heard when he called her. And didn't answer, didn't speak, or return. She stood, and then ran, and hid in the fern. He never found her, though he looked everywhere, and he asked at her mother's house, was she there? Sudden and swift and light as that the ties gave, and he learned of finalities besides the grave. Now this is a very Frostian tragic poem. Frostian in the sense that, just like with most of Frost's other tragedy poems, he tends to begin the poem in a very untypical or atypical fashion when it comes to tragic poems, in the sense that he begins it off in a very light-hearted sense, in a very ordinary sense, setting the reader up for something of a mild poem, in many cases a playful poem with a very lyrical rhythm to it. And in that sense, it's not only until the very last stanza, but sometimes even the very last few lines of the poem, that Frost then uses a sudden twist to bring about the tragic end of the poem, which, because of the fact that he spent most of his time setting the reader up for a mild, lighthearted poem, that tragedy that he brings in at the end really puts that thrust in and really grabs the reader and keeps hold of the reader and has that poem burn into the reader's mind. So The Impulse is not that different from many of other tragedy poems written by Frost. And basically, the story of The Impulse is very straightforward. It essentially focuses on the wife of a woodsman, and basically the wife gets an opportunity, or seizes an opportunity, to enjoy herself and to live a carefree day. But lo and behold, she ends up wandering too far, and in the end that results in her death. Now, in this poem I see two very core lessons in this. One being something that I believe Frost really saw, was that just as happy moments in life tend to be spontaneous, tragic moments in life can equally be as spontaneous. Tragedy is spontaneous just as much as happiness is spontaneous. And that's true in many cases, though not all cases. And also, another lesson that seems to stick out is something I believe Frost didn't really have in mind when he wrote this, but this is something that at least speaks to me. In today's world, a lot of stuff is floating around. A lot of cliches, or rather rehashed cliches, are floating around and hitting mainstream over and over and over again. And these things tend to fall in the line of carpe diem, seize the day, live life to the fullest, live life as though there was no tomorrow, live life with no regrets. Now, I generally understand the basic spirit of all those things, and I'm not saying that I disagree with them. In fact, many of them I don't necessarily disagree with all of it. But the fact is, there's a very good portion of it that does irk me a bit. And basically, especially with regards to a cliched saying of living life with no regrets, is this: life has regrets. There's no other way around it. It's just reality. It's just the way the real world works. There is regret whether you want them or not, and everyone has to deal with regret at some point in their life. To ignore their existence is just to be in denial. That's basic. But the bigger fact, the bigger picture of this is this. It is through regrets that we learn our most valuable lessons. It is through regrets that we learn the most. And sadly, that's the way humanity works. It's not until we get screwed up, it's not until we screw up majorly, that we actually learn something important and have that important thing stick with us. Now, I'm not saying this to, put down humanity. I'm not saying this to say that humanity belongs in the gutter somewhere, which it doesn't. But I'm just saying is this. Every moment of life that we're given is a gift. Life is a gift. But you know what? Life is also a burden of responsibility. The greater the gift, the greater the burden of responsibility for that gift. And life is a wonderful gift. Existence is a wonderful gift. But because of how wonderful that gift is, the greater the burden comes with taking care of that gift. Now, this responsibility doesn't just span with ourselves, though it easily encompasses ourselves, but it also spans with not only being responsible to ourselves, but responsible for others. And I believe the impulse really expresses that in a very straightforward way. Because as you could read through that poem, it's very easy to say that there was obviously one casualty in this poem. That casualty is obviously the wife, who ends up dying in the end. But the fact is, in the impulse, there are actually 3 casualties here, though not necessarily physical. The first casualty is, as I mentioned before, the wife who dies in the end. But you know what? The second casualty here is the woodsman, who, despite his best efforts and valiant attempts to try to save his wife, ends up losing his wife. And in the end of the poem, he ends up standing beside her grave. The third tragedy, this third casualty of this poem, though not mentioned that many times throughout the poem, actually mentions only once briefly in the poem, is a mother of the woodsman's wife, who no doubt, although it doesn't specifically say, would probably be greatly distressed, greatly distraught after finding out the death of her daughter. So it goes to show that, even with the best intentions that we have, and even if we do have an intention to live life as a gift, with that gift comes responsibility. And, this wife had a responsibility, and sadly, through her own naiveness, through her own innocence, it ended up costing her life. And it ended up, hurting those around her, basically. Now, I won't go on as a broken record trying to explain this, because I think this message is obviously clear. I think all of you probably heard this message at least from your parents or from somewhere in school, or sometimes even in the TV. Well, in the rare cases that they actually broadcast something as wholesome as this, which doesn't happen that often, but that's just me ranting. But the fact is, with life comes responsibility, and the best way to live life fullest is to be responsible with life. So, this is my rant, and just with any other poetry installment, I have included the entire poem right below this field blog entry for your own personal reading, for your own enjoyment. And for those of you who have any comments, feel free to comment. And this has been the Mad Hermit with you once again. And I am signing off. Happy reading.